believe me. Okay. Um, got it. Okay. Um, they are so good. So the class recently finished discussing the novel, The Buddha in the Attic by Julie Otsuka. It's not a long novel, but it's remarkable in many ways. The first of which is its narrative voice. Most stories are either told in the first person singular or by a third person omniscient narrator. In fact, the Gospels of the New Testament, like the one we just heard, are presented by this third person, all-knowing, all-seeing narrator, who, for example, knows what the woman with the hemorrhage in Mark chapter 5 is thinking before she reaches out to touch Jesus's garment to be healed. And in fact, the narrative knows who touches Jesus before Jesus does, because he says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples, ever helpful, look around and say, "Look at all these people. Are you nuts? What do you mean, who touched me?" Okay. But the Buddha in the Attic is told in a remarkable first-person plural narrative voice. It is told in the voices of Japanese women who came to the United States in the late 1930s as mail-order brides for Japanese men already working and living in America. It begins by voicing their hopes on the ship, bringing them across the vast Pacific to start new lives with men they have never met. Here's a brief passage from early in the book as an example of this first-person plural narration. On the boat, the first thing we did before deciding who we liked and who we didn't like, before telling each other which of the islands we were from and why we were leaving, even before learning each other's names, the first thing we did was to compare photographs of our husbands. On the boat, we often wondered, would we like them? Would we love them? Would we recognize them from the pictures we saw when we first saw them on the dock? Well, you could probably guess the answer to that last question, but here it is. On the boat, we could not have known that when we first saw our husbands, we would have no idea who they were. What these women soon realized was that they were aliens in an alien land, completely dependent upon the will of others. In our first reading this morning from Exodus, we heard, "You shall not molest nor oppress an alien, for you were once aliens yourselves in the land of Egypt." The Hebrew word for alien is pronounced ger, G-E-R, or gerim in the plural. Many centuries before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, the Hebrews created laws that echoed the ancient Near Eastern customs of hospitality to strangers. Although it might be hard to believe, given the current state of that region, these customs of hospitality still endure there. We could consider the Japanese men who immigrated to the US in the first decades of the 20th century and the women who joined them as their new brides as 20th century examples of gerim. They were loosely protected by civil law and by economic necessity because they provided cheap labor for Western agriculture. But they lived as resident aliens in a strange land, and they received few civil rights. They were not allowed to become citizens. They were not allowed to buy property. The lid was shut tightly on the melting pot that was extolled during the civics classes of our youth, classes that glossed over or erased this shameful episode from our history textbooks. You know what happened next, but I'll let the Japanese women tell it. First, they told us we were being sent to the mountains. So be sure to dress warmly, for it would be very cold. Then we heard we were being sent to the desert, where there were poisonous black snakes and mosquitoes the size of small birds. Junkmen drove down the streets of our neighborhoods, offering $10 for a stove we had bought for $200 the year before, $5 for a refrigerator. Atsuko left heartbroken after saying farewell to all the trees in her orchard. Miyoshi left pining for her horse. Iyo left an alarm clock ringing somewhere deep in her suitcase, but did not stop to turn it off. Kimiko left her purse behind on the kitchen table, but would not remember it until it was too late. Haruko left a tiny laughing brass Buddha up high in a corner of the attic, where he is still laughing to this day. If it needs to be said, no Germans nor German Americans were rounded up and sent to internment camps during World War II, even though some German residents of the US were arrested and convicted of espionage, and some were actually executed. Not a single Japanese, whether an Issei, who was born in Japan before moving to America, or a Nisei, a person of Japanese parentage born in this country, was ever indicted, much less convicted, of conducting espionage in the States during the war. In fact, although Nisei men, the ones who were born here of Japanese parentage, were originally refused the opportunity to enlist, eventually the United States Army formed the 442nd Infantry Regiment, comprised almost entirely of Japanese American residents who fought in Europe, took heavy casualties, and became one of the most decorated American military units of the Second World War. And if you're ever in the Honolulu airport, you can see a wall mural that tells the story of the 442nd. A woman named Eri Aoyama is one of Joan's nieces. Her paternal grandfather served in the 442nd. Aaron's grandmother, whom he met and married after the war, was deposed in 1942 to an internment camp in Wyoming for the duration of the war. Erin is currently completing her doctorate on the history of the internment camps. Her research and the novels of Julie Otsuka cannot change the past, but can serve as reminders of our failures, and more importantly, as calls to renewing our commitment to extending generous hospitality to those who find themselves at the mercy of our society. Our readings today remind us that the same tradition which demanded hospitality for resident aliens also summarized the entire Torah in a few phrases. Love God with all of your being, and love your neighbor as yourself. In today's gospel, Jesus draws a straight line from the laws of Moses that preceded him by centuries to apply it to his time, place, and society. As the reformer he was, as the border crosser he was, he taught his followers that it was women, Samaritans, lepers, and even Gentiles who had to be considered neighbors, and thus loved as one would love God and as would one love oneself. In our second reading from Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, really the only one he wrote, but Second Thessalonians was someone else, but that's for theology class. Paul praises the congregation for their faith, for their forbearance and suffering for that faith, for their allegiance to him, always a big issue with Paul, right? And finally, for turning away from idols to worship the true God. If we're going to love our neighbors as ourselves, as Jesus commanded, the first idol from which we must turn away just might have to be the one we see in the mirror. This idol demands fealty as the center of our existence. Worshipping this idol compels us to see everything outside of the mirror as a threat to our security. Worshipping this idol results in the building of border fences and the hoarding of automatic rifles. Worshipping this idol leads us to condemn others in the name of our quote-unquote orthodox religion. However, instead of indulging in the piety of our religious devotions, we might do well to have a little brass Buddha in the corner of our attics, who would always be laughing at our anxious and corrosive self-centeredness. Jesus, the border crosser, said it something like this: those who would save their life will lose it, but those who lose their lives for the sake of the good news will find it. But border crossing is not a popular metaphor these days. Politicians who trumpet their devotion to Judeo-Christian values never seem to remember today's reading from Exodus. Yet the original genius of Jesus, Paul, and their followers seems to lie in their understanding that we are meant to become aliens in an alien land. We are all meant to be Gerim. We are supposed to find our homeland on the border, not in the security of the heartland. This is why pilgrimage endures as a central symbol in Christian tradition. Furthermore, loving God with all of our being and our neighbor as ourselves mean that we have to first recognize the divine spark in people who neither look nor sound nor smell like us. We are supposed to welcome those who cross borders seeking new lives, whether that border is a vast ocean or the treacherous Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama. To turn away from our idols, to love God with all of our being, and to love our neighbors as ourselves would mean that we learn how to narrate our story in the first person plural. No longer I, but we. Only then will we find the peace we seek. Only then will we find what salvation really means. Amen.